So welcome back to Third Age Reforged, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Misty Mountains, which of course have been given a bit of a change in the most recent hotfix, because they were very powerful before the hotfix was brought into being, but now they've been brought back in line with the rest of the factions, and they have their niche still, and they are still very powerful in the right hands, and indeed I think they are one of the easier factions to play, purely because they have quite a lot of fallback, and they have quite a lot of units which are generally good in nearly every matchup. So you can build your armies a little bit more easily without being punished for it, unlike Dale, for example, who I said were rather the opposite of that in a couple of faction showcases ago. But let's dive right on into the units, because I realised in the last few showcases I have started to waffle on a little bit, and I'd like to, these are a little bit more short and snappy as opposed to the really long-winded ones that I used to do. So we shall start off with the Ballista, which of course there isn't really much to say here. It is a standard Ballista. It does have the Orc model, they have this sort of like shielded thing at the front here, but functionally exactly the same, and of course the same thing applies to both the Ballista and the Catapult, as I've said, for any faction that has the standard siege. Generally speaking, in an open field you won't be seeing it too much, because the Orcs don't really need to coax people to come towards them, particularly the Misty Mountains. 9 times out of 10 they're going to be moving towards the enemy first before sort of opting to sit back and try and absorb the pressure. So now we move into some of their more significant units, and we start off at the front here, starting with the Goblin Infantry, and in a similar vein to the Orc Fodder from Mordor and the Naga Stalkers from Angmar. The first one is free. Now, unlike the Orc Fodder, who get 2 free units, you only get 1 for the Goblin Infantry. And they're not spears, so they don't have the infantry malice, so they can actually do some damage in melee against enemy infantry. Indeed, their attack of 4 is actually higher than some units that are, obviously much more expensive than they are, with a recruitment cost of 0. But obviously their defense values are very suspect. Their defensive skill isn't great, their armor is pretty woeful, and their shield value is low, but considering it's a free unit, these are not bad stats at all. Obviously the quintessential fodder in your ranks, and then over here we also have the armor upgrade model, which of course was the previous model for the underground goblins. Now they can hide under normal circumstances, so that means you can use them as a bit of a surprise net for enemy cavalry, and the Misty Mountains certainly have quite a few tools for dealing with enemy cavalry once it's bogged down, but obviously the general's in this unit over here, so that prevents its hiding from being apparent here. So that is the fodder, and now we move backwards into Misty Mountains mainline, and it's here where we see our first real difference to Mordor, which have some similarities to the Misty Mountains, but Mordor's main line is of a little bit more quality than the Misty Mountains in places, but there is one area in which the Misty Mountains has a genuine advantage. Now it's not here in the heavy Goblin Infantry. They are cheaper than the likes of the Morannon Orcs from Mordor, but obviously they pay a price for that in the sense that they are worse, noticeably in their total defense as well. Their defensive skill is low, their shield value isn't great, their armor isn't bad for a unit that only costs 475. Their attack is relatively low, but it's not any worse than some of the more defensive focused kingdoms of men who spend more on units of infantry such as this. So a decent tar pit, and obviously very good for sort of padding out your line with extra infantry, because there are a lot of them, but don't expect them to be coming out ahead in too many battles of sustained quality, because obviously they will also be laid low by AP units just as well as standard units. They don't really have a niche like that. But moving on, we do have a unit which can hold the hordes at bay for just a little bit longer than the heavy Goblin Infantry, and that is the heavy Goblin Halberds, of course. Again, the equivalent to the Morannon Halberds, they are worse than their Mordor equivalent, but again, I think they're cheaper, or they might actually be the same price actually, because I think they are a lot more comparable than the infantry variant, because of course Halberds tend to do the same sort of job regardless. Obviously they do have that bonus fighting cavalry and effectiveness against armor and the ability to form phalanx that all Halberds have, but obviously they are goblins, so generally speaking you can rout them off relatively easily if you don't have any of the Misty Mountain support units in place, and obviously you can. The overall quality of these individual units isn't great, but it's the amount you can field which can really leave opponents sweating a little bit, especially if they've got armor heavy. But going armor heavy against the Misty Mountains is something you'll want to avoid usually, because they can get a lot of cost efficiency off a unit like this, but in particular off this unit in particular over here, which is the heavy Goblin Spears. Possibly the most popular unit in the Misty Mountains roster. There's rarely going to be an army you see where the Misty Mountains don't bring a couple of units of these. Now you can't bring them in as great a numbers as you could pre-hotfix. This was probably the main aspect which made them OP. But having a look over here, they can make shield wall, obviously bonus fighting cavalry, but it's this effectiveness against armor which gives them their genuine strength and their total defense of 17 because of that really high shield value of 8. So archers are not really going to have as much of an effect on them as the other 2 heavy goblin units that we've seen thus far. 600 is the kind of money that you spend on infantry units usually, but this is definitely a worthwhile investment here, because obviously it means you can defend against cavalry, you can do decently against heavily armoured infantry, and there are a lot of them, 253. Definitely the basis of a lot of Misty Mountains armies and strategies, mixing them in there. So that's more AP, more anti-cav, which is something that the Misty Mountains can blanket their lines with. Speaking of AP, here is another unit, the Mountain Orc Berserkers. Obviously substantially less of them per unit than the heavy goblins we've just seen, only 123, but they can chant and inspire nearby troops. They can hide anywhere, which is another good one, so it's something else that you can leave hidden alongside stuff like your Goblin Infantry. But of course they are pretty woeful when they come under archer fire with an armor value of 1 and the lack of a shield. 13 attack and a charge bonus of 10 though means if they connect nicely with heavily armoured units, they're going to do a lot of damage very quickly. But they are very much a unit that you sort of point at the enemy and you expect them to die off very quickly, but they'll take a good chunk of men with them provided it's the right sort of matchup. Obviously heavily skillful elven swordsmen are going to carve their way through Mountain Orc Berserkers like this. However, if you want something a little less risky, a little bit more dependable perhaps, then you'll want the Black Oryx of the Mountains, who do cost 800 each, so that is more. But they do have a lot more men per unit at 203. Now they are not AP, and they cannot hide anywhere, so they don't have some of the utility that the Mountain Orc Berserkers do. But they have only 1 attack less, so they have the same charge bonus, but noticeably of course their total defense is much higher, because they do actually have a slight shield value because of the shields they carry on their backs. But it's their defensive skill and their armour which really push them over the top here. Total defense of 20 is really very good indeed, as you would expect from a unit that costs 800. And this is the unit that you'll often see really tying the Misty Mountains infantry line together with some genuine quality in and amongst the sea of goblins that you're bound to see at the front. Good unit, and obviously the new model from Cowering Coma is also very nice looking indeed. Moving on to a unit that you can now only have 1 of instead of 2 of, which wasn't always the case, the White Uruk Fearmongers, which in terms of a unit I would compare them to, it would actually be the Fountain Guard. Now the White Uruk Fearmongers are a halberd and not a two-handed spear, but they will have a similar effect on the enemy, believe it or not. Now unlike the Fountain Guard of course you can't have 2, so it's not quite the same sort of presence on the field that Gondor can manage, but they are still a very good unit. They can obviously inspire nearby troops, they also frighten nearby enemy infantry, so it's that very potent combination of keeping your own troops in the fight while routing the enemies off potentially. Obviously they can form phalanx, bonus against cavalry and effective against armor because they're halberds. They're very good halberds, these are good stats for halberdiers, and they can sit very happily in the middle of your infantry line, tying things together very, very nicely. Of course pikes can be a bit of a problem, but that is generally true for the Misty Mountains in terms of purely infantry perspective for the most part. But speaking of pikes, we'll get on to the Misty Mountains selection of trolls, which is a good way of dealing with pikes of course, and we start off with the utility trolls. The Cave Troll Drummers, which they have got a slightly different unit model now to the standard Troll Drummers from Mordor. I don't know if they're mechanically any different or not. I don't think they are. I mean, they have the same amount of hit points, and these melee stats are not terrific for trolls, but of course their real presence on the field is to keep all of your low tier units in check, which for the Misty Mountains is even more important than it is as Mordor, because with Mordor you're going to be bringing high tier units which will definitely be able to keep your men in the fight, but with the Misty Mountains your goblins have got low morale, and you need to keep them in the fight because your numbers are going to be one of the things that you're relying on to really win you the battle, because in terms of genuine quality you are going to come up wanting against a lot of other factions. So it's this unit will really come in very handy, particularly if you come up against a faction which is unlikely to relent their front lines quickly. Someone like the dwarves who are going to put up a solid front. Eventually you're going to be able to wear them down, however, and this is a unit which is really going to help you in doing that. However, probably an even more devastating force on the field is going to be the Irregular Cave Trolls, which are of course the fastest line breakers in the game, as I've said before. Obviously effective against armor, very good in melee trolls. Trolls are very powerful obviously, but there aren't very many of them. 5 hit points of course, cost 1,000, which is not terrible considering some of the trolls can run you closer to 1,300 like the Olak High. But obviously the cave trolls are more fragile when they get into sustained combat, but they break through a line so quickly and get to enemy skirmishers, and that's something else the Misty Mountains are really capable of doing. They can shut down enemy skirmishers very quickly with their numbers and with their line breaking ability that their trolls give them, and the cave trolls are very much the centre of that effort. However, if you do need a troll which is going to be slightly more durable in a melee perspective, then you have the snow trolls. Obviously they're a little bit better, they can frighten nearby enemy infantry, better melee stats across the board. They cost 100 more, which is not too much of an investment if you wanted to be a little bit more of a sit in the fight troll. But the snow trolls also have something else, which is I believe they are the fastest trolls in the game, which actually makes them quite an effective screen against enemy cavalry as well. Now, not that the Misty Mountains mounted contingent will often need any help in a sustained melee, but if you do go for the snow trolls, it does give enemy cavalry one more problem on the field which they wouldn't otherwise have. And then finally we move back into the 2 generals bodyguards options, that the Misty Mountains have available to them on foot, starting off with the safer option and the one you're probably likely to see a little bit more of, the Goblin King Bodyguard, and they are essentially just the super-powered version of the heavy Goblin Infantry, the red sort of rusted accents on their armour. Obviously, if you have a look, they inspire nearby troops and they frighten nearby enemy infantry, which is something quite good for a unit like this. But obviously, when you look at their stats, they are essentially a poor man's version of the human variants of such units. So something like the Carmel's Chosen or the Talon Knights, for example, will put these guys away individually pretty quickly. But of course, generally speaking, a unit like this is going to be surrounded by hundreds of their underlings. So that's really where they're going to excel, because it's very difficult to single a unit like this out, particularly with obviously their multiple HP, decent armour and shield values, and then obviously they're pretty good in melee as well. But if doing a little bit of extra damage is more your thing, then we have yet another unit which is effective against armour on foot for the Misty Mountains, the Blackback Mountain Berserkers. Obviously they can hide anywhere, and I suppose you could look at these guys as a super-powered version of the Mountain Orc Berserkers, although they do have substantially higher armour values than they do. No shield of course, but a very high defensive skill as well. Obviously this comes from the fact that they are dual-wielding, an attack of 18, charge bonus of 7, obviously chanting. Fear is something which a unit like this is obviously going to imbue. 1300 is a lot though, and they can be a bit of a risk, because if they do get focused down, then they can fall apart pretty quickly. But if they sit in an infantry fight, they can be very difficult to get rid of, and they will do immense amounts of damage against the right sort of target. But now we shall move on to the Archers and to the Mounted Contingent. So this is definitely a selection which is a little bit more thin on the ground than Khand, who we had a look at last time, but what they have here definitely gets the job done for the Misty Mountains most of the time. Starting off, we have the Naga Skirmishes, of course, who are very cheap javelins at 350, offering you those AP close-range missiles. Obviously, a missile attack of 6 is not the biggest that a javelin can have, but the AP damage really does help it in this regard, and they are very cheap. So if you wanted to bring just that little bit of extra close-range punch with AP, then this could certainly be the sort of unit which can fill that role. Although with the rest of the Misty Mountains AP in their main line, it's not going to be a critical selection like it could be for someone like Angmar, who has a little bit less AP, but for the most part I think the Naga Skirmishes do accent that very well if you really wanted to double down on that sort of warfare. However, a unit which for the most part you're going to see in basically every Misty Mountains army again is going to be the standard Goblin Archers, because they only cost 500, which is a very low amount of money. They only have a missile attack of 4, but there are a lot of them, and of course, as we've said before, low quality archers like this, their entire job is to simply bury the enemy beneath a hailstorm of low quality ammunition. And they do this very well. The Goblin Archers are one of the best at doing this, because obviously there's so many units on the field for the Misty Mountains that your archers really need to do their work quickly. And a unit like this really makes it difficult, because if you don't target them down, they will start to take their toll as the battle goes on. Obviously they're not a fantastic unit on their own, but when they are used correctly to support your army, they're a very good archer indeed, surprisingly enough. But moving back, if you do feel like going for a little bit more of a skirmish heavy approach, then the heavy Goblin Archers are not a bad pick either. There are less of them, however, and they are slightly more expensive, so you'll probably see them a little bit less, ironically enough, than the Goblin Archers in front of them. But they get the job done just fine. I mean, obviously, slightly higher armor value, slightly higher missile attack, slightly higher price to offset that. However, a unit you may very well see is going to be this, of course, the heavy Goblin Crossbowmen. Crossbows, we all know how devastating they can potentially be. A missile attack of 10, which is armor piercing. They do need a pretty clear line of sight in order to lay down this damage, however, but this is again something which can be used to ward off enemy heavy cavalry, or you can use it again to sort of help to mow down enemy infantry lines. But again, this is something which can make it very awkward to deal with the Misty Mountains, provided they're used well. Obviously, if you bring the heavy Goblin Crossbowmen, you can expect them to be the target of the enemy cavalry should you leave them open enough for a decent charge. But other than that, they are pretty standard crossbows. Not quite as good as the Uruk-hai, but they get the job done nonetheless. And now we move on to the Misty Mountains Mounted Contingent, which again is pretty powerful. I mean, it is a selection of wargs again. So we have here the Worg Riders, which we have seen before in other factions, obviously. So they are going to be low armor, no shield value, so eventually once their hit points have been expended, archers will absolutely shred through them. And obviously they do have that bonus fighting cavalry. It says they've got effectiveness against armor as well, although I'm not sure whether that's just off the charge or not, because I swear J-Monster told me that they don't have their effectiveness against armor in melee anymore, because that is what made them overpowered in the previous patch. But nonetheless, obviously the wargs are at their happiest when they're sat in sustained melee against enemy cavalry. If any outside influences are on that fight, however, the Worg Riders tend to do quite badly, so you do need to be quite careful with them. However, if you want a little bit of support, you can also bring the Worg Skirmishes, which again we have seen before, and there is no real difference between the wargs across the factions. It's really the highest tier of warg, which is different between Mordor, Isengard, Angmar, I suppose, and of course the Misty Mountains, obviously 750. Javcav, which have that effectiveness against cavalry and melee as well, so they are pretty difficult to get rid of, honestly. Foot archers are going to be your best bet if you wanted to, but they do have an armor upgrade apparently as well, which is not immediately apparent what it changes, but again it's going to be one of those units. So you can upgrade the armor if you want, which will make them a little bit more resilient against archers, but honestly it might be a bit of a fool's gambit to try and do that, honestly, because they're still going to have a weakness to them. But finally, of course, just like the Champions of the White Hand from Isengard, the Misty Mountains have their very powerful Worg unit, and that is the Bolgs Champions. Now the Bolgs Champions, not quite as strong as the Melkor's Chosen or the Champions of the White Hand, but they are cheaper, and they do tie the Misty Mountains cavalry line together, because very, very little is going to want to get involved in a straight one-to-one melee engagement with the Bolgs Champions. Only the best of the heaviest melee cavalry is going to even want to attempt it. Everything else is going to want to run for the hills. But other than that, obviously fantastic stats across the board. 2 HP, 1200 is not a bad amount of money to spend on a mounted general's bodyguard either, and they also have a charge bonus of 10, which is always nice. And then finally we have the Drake Broodlings, which I've put in the cavalry section, which I'm not sure whether that's a mistake or not. I mean, they do play rather like trolls, like sort of crossed with wargs, I suppose. Bit of a strange one. Obviously weapon type cannot be upgraded. Really high stats across the board, well, high attack stats across the board. Their total defense is pretty poor because they don't have armor or a shield, and obviously they have only 6 defensive skill. They have 3 hit points. Their charge is devastating, however, a charge bonus of 15, special attack as well, so very much a niche unit, I would say, because obviously, well, a risky unit, I suppose you would say, because obviously fire arrows are going to do devastating amounts of damage to the Drake Broodlings, but in the past we have seen them be devastating, but we have also seen them die off very, very quickly when they get themselves into a sticky situation. So interesting unit. They have their uses, but if you wanted to build a more balanced army, it might be best to leave them at home. But if you wanted to try something a little bit more adventurous, then they're always there available for you. So that is the Misty Mountains roster. Quick look at them. So we'll head back to the army selection screen, talk a little bit more about what I like about the goblins. So the first thing to note here, if we have a look at the morale, obviously 8 for that one, 8 for this unit, 8 for that unit as well. The lower tier units have got terrible morale, so you're going to need to bring support units to keep them in the fight. Otherwise, when they start to take losses, or if they take a bit of shock damage from either infantry or especially cavalry charging them from behind, your goblins are going to go running for the hills, and that could spell disaster, because without your numbers, you really are in a bit of a sticky situation as the Misty Mountains. Your heavy goblin core, as long as it's supported, however, can be a very difficult thing to deal with if it's managed properly, because there are so many units that you can potentially bring onto the field, so many goblins the enemy are going to have to chew their way through, and obviously for a lot of Gap factions the first option to do that would be to try and plug them away at range and do damage from there and try to cull the herd a little bit before it ever gets into melee. But the Misty Mountains have really got a few units, especially the cave trolls, which are very good at shutting that sort of thing down. You can spread your line very wide as the Misty Mountains cast a wide net, and it's difficult to deal with, but it isn't impossible. It used to be a lot more difficult, obviously, when they could blanket their line with very difficult to get rid of and very cost-effective heavy goblin spears. Now, though, I think you can only have 3. Yeah, it used to be, I think, 4, 5, or even 6. No, it was 4, wasn't it? It's only been reduced by a little bit, but then the Misty Mountains do rely on the heavy goblin spears quite a bit to sort of tie their front line together. And obviously against heavily armoured factions, this is going to pay off most of all, because they've got a lot of armour-piercing units in their line. Not to say they're bad against stuff like the elves, because against the elves their extra numbers can really start to hurt them if things start to go south for the elves. You can really push home the advantages of the Misty Mountains, but I do feel as though they are one of the easier factions to get the most out of as it stands, because generally speaking you're just going to point your very large attack focused army towards the enemy. Any enemy archers are going to be sort of weakened down a little bit by your very cheap archers and then engaged in melee by the cave trolls, while their front line gets outnumbered, outmaneuvered and slowly crushed. Now there are ways to deal with that, but of course if you're looking for a good place to start, if you're looking for one of the easier factions to play, in my opinion, then the Orcs, the Misty Mountains are for you, because really the only danger is trying to keep your wargs out of the archers' line of sight and trying to keep your front line from breaking, which honestly with something like the troll units like the troll drummers and also units like the White Oryx fearmongers and your general's bodyguard, that should be an easy enough task for the most part. So yeah, that was a quick look at the Orcs of the Misty Mountains. I hope you found this somewhat informative. The next faction that we're going to be taking a look at, I think, will be Cardolan.